Take it from the standpoint of three important topics, and we'll treat the Trump topic of what he's doing or what he's trying to do last. First thing I want to point to is the global energy complex. For those that haven't been keeping score, the global energy complex consists of effectively thousands of oil tankers, refineries, production facilities, not simply in the Persian Gulf, but all over the world. And we're discovering some things that we didn't fully appreciate before. That if you take 15 million barrels of oil off the market every day, in fact, some people would say it's closer to 20, but we'll stick with 15 at the moment, that this disrupts not just those states that trade with the Gulf Cooperation Council or Kuwait or Qatar or Iran or anybody else. It suddenly affects everyone all over the globe. A good example, of course, is Australia. Has almost no petroleum strategic reserve. They are going to run out of diesel in an estimated 12 to 13 days. They have no refining capability, although they do have some oil left. And that means that their entire economy is effectively going to grind to a halt. This is just Australia. You find this very strange. I do, but then again, everybody tends to be complacent over time. They take things for granted. This energy complex, though, the situation could very, very quickly worsen. And we'll talk.
The Colonel deliberately uses precise, alarming numbers: 15 million barrels, 12 to 13 days, no refining capability, to hammer home how fragile the just-in-time global supply chains have become after decades of complacency. He repeatedly emphasizes that people take things for granted and that everybody tends to be complacent over time, painting a picture of a system that was already operating on razor-thin margins. The ripple effect is immediate and universal. This isn't a localized Gulf problem. It's a worldwide disruption that could very, very quickly worsen. By highlighting Australia's vulnerability first, McGregor makes the abstract global energy complex feel personal and urgent. Entire economies could literally stop moving within 2 weeks. He also notes the short-term profiteering. The oil industry is making a lot of money, but stresses we cannot possibly make up for the shortfall because of loading capacity limits, foreshadowing domestic rationing rumors in Washington. This segment establishes the foundational domino. Energy is the lifeblood, and once it's cut off at this scale, everything else collapses. Takeaway: a single choke point in the energy complex can paralyze entire economies faster than most people imagine. Short, intriguing question. Australia out of diesel in 13 days, how long would yours last?
About that in a second. One of the unfortunate consequences is the fact that 35% of the world's fertilizer is gone. It's not available.
Wow.
That is practically the green revolution in reverse. Very few people today know anything about the green revolution that happened 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, where people finally learned how to grow great quantities of food, which has contributed enormously to the growth in population. Right now, even if everything stopped right now, with that 35% shortfall in fertilizer, the world would be staring at famine over the next 2 years in various parts of the world. Even in the United States, where we have a fertilizer shortage, we are going to face in the future some food shortages. And we're probably in better shape than most people simply because we have as much oil as we do. Now, that brings me to something else. Right now, large numbers of tankers are lining up to come to the West Coast or the Gulf Coast and to try and load up on oil that they can't get anywhere else. Obviously, the oil industry is making a lot of money in the short term, but we're finding out that we cannot possibly make up for the shortfall because we can't even load that much oil in the time allotted. And we're also beginning to hear rumors in Washington that over the next few months, they're going to have to stop exporting oil because we're going to need it here at home.
Here the Colonel connects the energy crisis directly to food security with devastating clarity, invoking the historical green revolution that happened 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, where people finally learned how to grow great quantities of food, which has contributed enormously to the growth in population. By calling the current situation the green revolution in reverse, he underscores the reversal of decades of agricultural progress caused by the same petrochemical disruptions. The 35% shortfall is not a minor blip. It's a structural collapse that will trigger famine over the next 2 years, even if fighting ceases today. He reinforces the interdependence. Fertilizer production relies on the very oil and gas now being taken off the market, and even America, with its oil advantage, will still see shortages. This segment reveals the hidden second-order catastrophe. Modern farming is energy-intensive, and without it, the population boom of the last century becomes unsustainable. The repeated wow reactions from the host only amplify how shocking these cascading consequences are to the audience. Takeaway: energy wars don't just raise gas prices. They can reverse 70 years of food abundance and trigger global hunger. Short, intriguing question: what happens when the green revolution runs out of fuel? If these insights hit hard, follow World Talk Recap for more unfiltered analysis, and subscribe here for every new breakdown.
Which means we're also going to see rationing here, which people have no experience with.
Wow.
I think we need to understand the impact of all this and remember, this is a war of choice. This is something Trump decided to do with the acquiescence of Congress. There was no vote. There was no declaration of war. There was no case made to the American people, frankly. But the energy complex is in ruins. It's going to get worse. The next thing, petrodollar. The petrodollar has been the source of I would argue, much of our prosperity and certainly much of our wealth. And this is the agreement that stemmed from the 1970s, where the agreement was essentially that all trade in energy would be in dollars, and that those dollars, once that had been accomplished, those dollars would find their way back into our economy. They would go into our treasuries and help finance our debt and essentially finance debt-based consumption, which is what we're in. We're in debt-financed consumption. We're living far beyond our means. All of that is about to come to a crashing end. Most people don't understand that because, not just because of the closure of the straits, but it's very clear that Iran has said you can buy whatever you want here, but you can't do it in dollars. It has to be done in preferably yuan, but we'll take rubles, we'll take other forms of currency. In the meantime, part of the community that has supported this petrodollar and the debt financed consumption in the United States consists of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. The Emirates are not yet completely destroyed, but certainly I would say they're at probably 50 to 60% and could easily go to 70, 80, or 90%. Saudi Arabia right now is trying to export across the country through the pipeline over to Yenbo and Jeddah and elsewhere and utilize the Red Sea. Well, we have this group called the Houthis that the Saudis waged war against for several years. They're in a position to stop that. They don't have to sink any ships. They just have to destroy the port facilities. Even easier is to simply hit the pipeline.
Right.
And I used to ride up and down that pipeline in the run-up to Desert Storm. It's very obvious. It's very easy. There's nothing hidden about it. And the major oil infrastructure facilities for refining and producing and so forth, so on, are in Al Jabal, which is an enormous port that's on the Gulf Coast. If that's destroyed, then I would say you're looking at perhaps as much as 10 years to recover inside the Gulf.
Wow.
President Trump does not seem to have considered any of these things. It doesn't seem to have figured prominently in any discussion because the emphasis from the beginning was always on Israel. We have to do this for Israel. I don't know that the United States historically has ever gone to war exclusively for one other state, another state, especially since our vital strategic interests are not at risk, and we're not at risk at the time. Now that's changed. But certainly at the time we declared war, that was, or didn't declare war, we just went to war. That was not the case.
McGregor methodically dismantles the foundation of American prosperity by explaining how the petrodollar recycled oil revenues into U.S. treasuries, enabling debt-financed consumption, where we're living far beyond our means. He quotes Iran's explicit rejection, not in dollars, preferably yuan, to show the deliberate shift away from dollar dominance. Saudi vulnerabilities are laid bare with insider detail. McGregor mentions riding up and down that pipeline in the run-up to Desert Storm, and how it's very obvious. It's very easy. Nothing hidden about it. The Houthis don't need to sink ships. Destroying port facilities or pipelines is enough to cripple exports for years. The 10 years to recover timeline for Al Jabal underscores the long-term strategic damage. This isn't just economic theory. It's the end of the financial loop that propped up U.S. debt and lifestyle, accelerated by a war of choice decided without congressional declaration or public debate. Takeaway: the petrodollar's collapse would end America's ability to live far beyond its means. Short, intriguing question: if oil can't be bought in dollars, what backs the dollar tomorrow?
That brings us to the problem of Donald Trump. Everybody says, what is his strategy? What is he doing? I think to understand Donald Trump, and I didn't want to accept this for a long time, but now I absolutely embrace it. We have to go back and look at his great mentor, the man who most profoundly shaped Trump's character, education, and upbringing. That wasn't his father. It was a man named Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn had 3 rules for life. I think the first one was attack, attack, attack. Never stop attacking. In other words, be relentless, regardless of whether or not you think you can win, regardless of whether or not your cause is just. Those things don't matter. There's no morality involved. If you want something, you just attack, attack, attack till you get it. Secondly, deny everything. If you've done something wrong, if you've made a mistake, don't worry about it. Just deny, deny, deny. So those first 2 rules are very important. The third one was declare victory at all times. Whatever happens, you're a success. Whatever happens, you are victorious. Everyone else failed. Everyone else is irrelevant. Everyone else is stupid. You're the genius. You win. Declare victory, move on. Well, this has certainly served President Trump rather well. After all, he's declared bankruptcy 6 times. You could almost argue that for him and for many people in New York City who operate at that level of hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, bankruptcy is a business model.
Right.
Because you declare bankruptcy, you start over fresh. And you get money from someone else to build whatever you're going to try to do the next time around. So I think if you understand those things and you understand if there is anything called a strategy, it falls under those 3 points. And he decided he was going to attack Iran in support of Israel. Now, why would that be? Well, we could spend a lot of time tracing all the money, but clearly without the Zionist billionaires who provided him with enormous money and also herded people into their camp that had previously been against Trump, because the 2020 election was very different from the 2024 election. If you go back and look at it, Zuckerberg and a whole range of other people that had spent hundreds of millions of dollars to defeat Trump were absent. They pulled out. And in fact, they started showing up at Mar-a-Lago to kiss his ring. These people wanted war with Iran. They wanted war with Iran for at least 30, some people would say 40 years. Some people would say 47, but certainly for the last 30, it's indisputable.
Right.
And the notion was always that Israel will never be safe until all of its enemies are vanquished. And the most serious enemy is Iran. That was the argument. Remember, Iran's the state sponsor of terror in the world and all this. It's all crap. It's not true. It doesn't make any difference. Truth doesn't matter. Remember, attack Iran, and then you get into this problem of, well, General, how long is this going to last? What's this going to take? What do you think we can do? And you turn to the intelligence community. You turn to your Israeli friends who are the ones putting you up to this anyway. And eventually it comes down to, well, it probably won't last more than a few days, maybe a week. They'll collapse. We'll get what we want. Well, that's failed. There's any chance of that happening, and only a low-grade moron would have concluded such a thing were even possible. I think
The Colonel traces Trump's behavior back to Roy Cohn's immoral playbook with surgical precision, listing the 3 rules verbatim and illustrating them with Trump's own history. Declared bankruptcy 6 times, bankruptcy is a business model. He explains how these rules explain the lack of any real strategy. If there is anything called a strategy, it falls under those 3 points. The war's true driver is revealed. Not U.S. vital interests, but pressure from Zionist billionaires who flipped from opposing Trump in 2020 to supporting him in 2024, showing up at Mar-a-Lago to kiss his ring. McGregor calls out the long-standing demand: Israel will never be safe until all of its enemies are vanquished. The most serious enemy is Iran, and dismisses justifications as all crap. It's not true. Truth doesn't matter. This segment exposes the war as a personal and financial transaction rather than geopolitics, with attack, 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 overriding morality or consequences. Takeaway: Trump's Iran policy is less grand strategy and more Roy Cohn 101. Attack relentlessly, deny failure, declare victory. These revelations too good to miss? Follow World Talk Recap right now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next segment.
Israelis just lied to him, and he chose to believe the lie. Now he finds himself in a very difficult situation, and he can't admit defeat. He has to deny that anything has failed. And so we keep listening to this trope of, well, we've destroyed their army, or their air force and their navy. Well, they really haven't had an air force since the Shah left the country.
Right.
There's nothing to destroy. And navy, well, they had 7 old frigates, which were easy to target and sink. Not a problem. Then they have lots of these small boats. They have unmanned submersibles. They have unmanned craft on the surface. We haven't hit all of those. It's very difficult to do so. And they've got probably pens full of these damn things that they can send out at will. But we're still trying to do what we can. But he keeps falling back on these metrics that are familiar from the past, from Vietnam.
Right.
For you go back to Desert Storm, you can listen to Schwarzkopf stand up there and say, well, today we destroyed 152 artillery pieces and 300 tanks. Okay, fine. We found out that most of that was crap, was not true. And secondly, it didn't make any difference. It didn't induce anybody to go anywhere. They stayed where they were. We have something similar now with Iran, except that Iran's been preparing for this for at least 20 years. They have built massive underground complexes. The amount of damage inflicted on them is only visible on the surface, and it doesn't seem to have had much impact on their ability to continue launching missiles at all kinds of ranges up to theater ballistic missiles, and they seem to have thousands and thousands of unmanned systems or drones left.
Right.
So that hasn't worked. And there's no evidence that Iran is starving. There's no evidence that Iran is about to disintegrate. There's no evidence that Iran is about to suffer tremendous unrest. If anything, there's a lot of evidence that we forced a great deal of cohesion on Iranian society. So that brings us to the final question. What are we going to do? And what about the blockade? Well, I would argue the blockade is not as serious as the president would like everyone to think. I think the blockade is part of this ceasefire facade. What's the ceasefire for? It's to replenish, refurbish, refit, refuel, rearm. That's what is going on in our camp. And by the way, that's happened with the Iranians. They have been refueled, rearmed, replenished by the Russians and the Chinese to the extent that they can. I think many of Iran's alleged losses have been made good, frankly, over the last few days, particularly by the Chinese. And so, President Trump seems to compensate for what is not happening by creating the illusion that things are happening. So he sends out these tweets. Oh, well, China promised me they're not going to send any more weapons, and they love me. I'm going to make them happy because they're going to get into the Gulf too, and they say, fine, let's go. It's all nonsense. It makes no sense. It's not real. Then we discover that during the last talks, our friend J.D. Vance, the vice president, stands up a couple of times, goes out of the room, and appears to have reported progress to Mr. Netanyahu. And we see that Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner, two people who are not strictly speaking part of the government, have no diplomatic credibility. They've never done any work like that in the past. They just happen to be Trump's billionaire friends and Jewish, and apparently Zionists. That's enough to qualify them to go represent the interests of the United States and the American people. Put this picture together and you ask, well, what are you going to do now, Donald? And I think Donald has concluded that he only has one option, and that is to utterly destroy Iran, because he thinks that will compel the disintegration of the Iranian state and society, and ultimately compel the Iranians to do whatever the Israelis want them to do, because after all, that's what this is all about. We are not making demands. We say there are demands, but they are Israeli demands. What's the first Israeli demand? No more uranium enrichment. Absolutely off the table. Have to give it up completely and have to surrender your sovereignty to us by allowing us to inspect and ensure that that's the case. Well, the Iranians aren't going to do that. If they've learned one lesson from this war, they've learned that if you don't have a nuclear weapon, you are vulnerable to attack by the United States and Israel, both of whom do have nuclear weapons. And I think the others are very simply, you've got to dismantle most of your ballistic missile arsenal, because that threatens us, and we want you to be vulnerable to attack in perpetuity by us. So that has to go. And then finally, what's the last one? Well, I think the last one is you can't work with or support any of your friends in the region. What?
Yeah.
So the Iranians have said, no, we can't do that. Well, then you must be destroyed. End of discussion. And even though Israel's in very poor shape, has sustained a lot of damage, there's no question about it. We're not allowed to see it, obviously, but it's pretty severe. And large numbers of people have left Israel trying to get out, obviously, the Jewish citizens of Israel. But the bottom line is that we're all waiting around for the ceasefire to end. And that's just the pause to rearm, refit, replenish. So that ends on Monday. So I think on Monday, they will commence the mother of all bombing campaigns. It'll be another attempt at a quote-unquote war-winning air and missile campaign to bring Iran to its knees. And that won't work. And after 4 or 5 days of intensive bombing and missiles and everything else, the Iranians aren't going to show up to surrender. The Iranians are going to continue to launch missiles. The real question is, do we get to the point where Donald Trump says, well, that's all I can do. I can't do any more. I'm declaring victory. Can he leave at that point?
Right.
Well, it depends on who you are. If you're Donald Trump, you may not be able to leave. People will say, wait a minute now, you're going to turn over everything in the Persian Gulf to all of these other people and turn the strait over to the Iranians. You can't just do that. Of course, we've already done that.
McGregor contrasts outdated body count metrics. Today we destroyed 152 artillery pieces and 300 tanks. With 21st century reality, noting that such claims was crap, didn't make any difference in past wars like Vietnam or Desert Storm. Iran's preparations include massive underground complexes and thousands of unmanned systems or drones. So surface damage doesn't seem to have had much impact. He highlights the irony. They really haven't had an air force since the Shah left, and the Navy was just 7 old frigates. The ceasefire facade is exposed as mutual rearming, with Russia and China stepping in to replenish losses. Far from disintegration, the war has produced a great deal of cohesion on Iranian society. This segment proves the campaign has already failed strategically, yet denial, he can't admit defeat, keeps it going. Takeaway: air campaigns and body count thinking cannot break a prepared, dug-in adversary like Iran. How many last bombing campaigns until reality sets in?
Troops that have been shipped over there or flown in, whatever you want to call it, they are largely light infantry. Now, they're good soldiers, good Marines. They're organized, trained, and equipped for missions that went away 30, 40 years ago, but we cling tenaciously to the past when it comes to the American military. So we still have an airborne division ready to drop on somebody somewhere and be utterly annihilated. There's a wonderful book that's called Thriving on Failure, and it's all about airborne forces, and it goes through all the existing airborne forces and how many there are and what there were to begin with. We're the ones who have this large division full of light infantry. But in 1991, when Schwarzkopf, who was an infantry officer, was told, why don't we take the 82nd and let them jump into, say, An Nasiriyah, which was a giant airfield near the Euphrates River. He said, what are you, crazy? How can we be sure that the air defenses there won't open up and kill everybody? He said, forget it. They're not going. So when the 82nd did ultimately get in, they rode on school buses. Kind of a humiliating experience for a paratrooper, but they rode on school buses into the country. Then you have the Marines. The Marines wanted to stage an assault on the Kuwait city port. And Schwarzkopf basically threw them out and said, what are you, nuts? You're going to have more people killed in accidents, and we don't need it. It's too risky. Forget it. It's a waste of time, because the Marines had tried to make a landing on the Iraqi coast. One of the Navy's vessels hit a mine, and that was the end of it, because mines, what do you do about them? How do you know that you've got them all? You only need 2 or 3 mines out there. In fact, a Marine general at the time said all you have to do is see a bunch of people throw 50-gallon drums into the water, and that's the end of the amphibious operation. So we have these light infantry, and presumably they want to use them to seize islands in the Persian Gulf, on the assumption that if you seize 2 or 3 islands, that this is a game changer. I haven't figured out how, because at the end of the day, none of the ships that want to move through that strait are going to be underwritten by insurance. Lloyd's of London won't do it. Won't have anything to do with it under any circumstances, as long as it's a war zone. It was Lloyd's of London that shut down the Strait of Hormuz, not Iran. Now, Iran has got it under control, but how does seizing a couple of islands change that? If anything, assuming they could get to those islands without being shot out of the sky, then they've got to stay there. That means they've got to protect themselves from the tactical ballistic missiles and the unmanned systems. Specifically, the Shahad drones and all these things that come pouring in with warheads on them with pinpoint accuracy. I don't see anything good emerging from this. And I don't think that Donald Trump, as we discussed before, is prepared to admit defeat. So we're going to see one last, I think, dramatic attempt to crush Iran. After that, anything is possible. But I continue to wonder what the Chinese in particular may do. And then if you look at the rest of the region, the Israeli leaders have been talking openly in ways I think are very, very dangerous, but they're not wrong, but they're doing it publicly, insisting that Turkey is, or as they say now, Turkey is the way they want you to pronounce it, is really postured to attack Israel. Well, from the very beginning, Ottoman Turkey, and then subsequently the Turkish state we had today, has been the 500-pound gorilla in the room. They are a natural strategic power, if you will. The regional dynamics produce that. In fact, if you go back over the last 2,000 years, you can argue you have two great powers. One is Turkey, and the other is Persia. Now, the Persians have taken a beating, but they're not going out of business. They're not going under. They're not going to surrender. Israel has taken a terrible beating. And this next round, I think, could be fatal to Israel in many ways. And the Israelis, this is President or Prime Minister Netanyahu and his predecessor, Naftali Bennett, have both said that the Turks are potentially an even greater threat to Israel than Iran.
Wow.
So I guess the assumption is that they're now going to harness the American armed forces to an attack on the Turks. I don't think that's going to work. Then you have Egypt, and Egypt is a boiling pot. And our friend General Sisi is swimming uncomfortably in the boiling water. He could be gone any minute. He's afraid to do anything for fear that whatever he does may backfire. But Egypt and its population and its armed forces are up in arms and want desperately to punish the Israelis for what they've done to their Palestinian Arab brethren. And then, of course, on the other side, you have Mr. Erdogan and his Ottoman aspirations. They have the largest army in NATO. They have exceptionally competent ground forces, well-armed, well-equipped. They have missiles, tactical ballistic missiles, theater ballistic missiles, a lot of unmanned systems. They have a substantial navy that can do a lot of damage from the sea. What's to stop the Turks and the Egyptians from suddenly moving decisively against Israel to finish it off? Why would they not do that? The hatred today for the Jewish state in the region is greater than at any point in its entire history. So, all these things are possibilities. I'm not Nostradamus. I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I can tell you the potential is terrible.
Right.
And then, of course, we haven't talked about the nuclear weapon or weapons that Israel has at its disposal that it could potentially use. Now, the Russians have made some threatening statements, warning the Israelis not to even think about it. The Pakistanis have promised that if the Israelis use a nuclear weapon, they will see to it that Israel is nuked. And, of course, the Chinese have said this would be the demise of Israel.
Right.
So one hopes that will not happen, but we don't seem to have any control over Israel.
The Colonel details military mismatches. U.S. forces are light infantry organized, trained, and equipped for missions that went away 30, 40 years ago, using historical examples like the 82nd Airborne riding on school buses in 1991 and Marines' failed amphibious plans. Seizing islands changes nothing because Lloyd's of London won't do it, under any circumstances as long as it's a war zone. Regional risks escalate dramatically. Turkey, the 500-pound gorilla, and Egypt are poised to act, with hatred today for the Jewish state, greater than at any point in its entire history. He openly questions Trump's stability, pretend to be a Christ-like figure, suggests a certain instability of mind, and the cabinet's fear, while warning that J.D. Vance offers no fundamental change. The intelligent exit, an international conference to let Iran manage the strait like Turkey does the Dardanelles, is politically impossible under Roy Cohn's rules. This final segment ties everything into a global goat screw with catastrophic potential for the U.S. Takeaway: the conflict risks sucking in Turkey, Egypt, Russia, and China while exposing both leadership failure and the limits of military power. Will Trump declare victory, or will reality declare it for him? Want the full unvarnished truth on where this is headed? Subscribe to Word Talk Recap, smash subscribe, and join the conversation below. Thank you for watching/reading this segmented deep dive. Drop your answer to any of the questions. Let's keep the discussion going.